for listeners that might want a bit of free or easy performance that you see is how critical panel gaps are. So we see cars with like horrible fitment. The amount of drag that creates is massive. It's important enough that Porsche, when you're at Le Mans, lost because of their panel gaps and the straightaways there being so critical.
Welcome to the HPA Tuned In podcast. I'm Andre, your host, and in this episode, we're joined by Amir from RS Future. This is a company that specializes in making aerodynamic components, and it's no secret that over the last decade or so, the use of aero components, particularly at the upper echelons of motorsport and the likes of World Time Attack, has really grown to the point that if you want to be competitive, then this is no longer optional. You really have to embrace aerodynamics. But traditionally, this requires consulting with specialists, having your car perhaps 3D scanned, and then custom aero packages designed around your car. And that's as expensive and as time consuming as it sounds. RS Future take a slightly different approach to this, applying best practice to the design of components to suit a particular car. And this is really an application of the 80-20 rule, where we're getting around 80% of the performance for about 20% of the effort. Now, obviously those numbers might not be quite accurate, but hopefully you can get the idea. So really, in essence, this podcast is going to be useful for anyone at a club level or semi-professional level of motorsport where you don't have a budget for a consultant to do your aero package, and you're looking at the options available and how best to utilize your aero budget. Before we jump into our chat, for those who are new to the Tuned In podcast, High Performance Academy is an online training school. We specialize in teaching people how to build performance engines, how to tune EFI, how to construct wiring harnesses. We also cover topics on fabrication, 3D modeling and CAD, race driver education, and data logging, just to name a few. You can find all of our courses at hpacademy.com/courses. All of these courses are delivered in high-definition video modules that you can watch from anywhere in the world, provided you've got an internet connection. This means you can learn from the comfort of your own place and you can learn at your own pace. All of our courses also come with a 60-day, no questions asked, money-back guarantee. So if you purchase them for any reason at all, decide it wasn't quite what you expected, no problem, let us know. We'll give you a full refund. And for podcast listeners, you can also use the coupon code podcast75. That will get you $75 off the purchase of your very first HPA course. We'll put the coupon code in the show notes to make it nice and easy for you to find. Lastly, if you like free stuff, then I've got a great deal for you. We are constantly partnering with some of the biggest names in the aftermarket performance industry to give away some great prizes. You can always find our latest prize at hpacademy.com/giveaway. It might be an aftermarket ECU or dash. It could be some engine components or engine building tools, or just about anything in between. They are great prizes, and we will ship them free of charge to your door if you're the winner. There's no tricks here, no purchase required to get your name into the draw. All right, enough with our introduction. Let's get into our interview now. All right, thanks for joining us today, Amir. And as we always do, I want to start by finding out a little bit about your background and specifically how you developed a passion for cars and motorsport.
So my dad was pretty into cars, standard story for most of us. My dad was into cars. My mom used to do a bit of off-road racing in Guam, where she's from. So it kind of ran in the family. Yeah.
That's an unusual angle for the story,
Yeah.
but all power to her.
Yeah. So she's obviously always been a huge fan of cars as well. And then just, typical, once you get to like 14, 15, like most dudes, becomes a pretty big passion for you. Start getting really interested in them. And then mine just took off and never really stopped. And so I'd say, like most people, it's started with family and then just an interest to learn. So as I started to progress, when I was early 20s, I was really interested in the mechanical aspect of it. And so did a lot of reading on vehicle dynamics, bought every book I could to learn about it, every book I could on data acquisition, engineering, data analysis, that kind of thing, and self-taught myself with my own personal cars, just got a little AIM Solo 2 to start with and started reading data, learning how to use it. And then I also had always loved racing. So ended up going to the track. I was too broke to actually pay for track days. So went and started instructing at autocrossing, then tracked local event organizers. And from there, it was like, gosh, probably 15, 17 years of doing it. So it's just been a progression. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. A couple of things I wanted to dig into there. A little off topic, but just since you brought it up, that AIM Solo 2, I think, is one of the best places to get started with data acquisition. It's that perfect balance between giving you just enough data to learn data acquisition and improve the car and driving, but not drowning you in so many channels of data you don't know where to start looking. So I think that is the perfect tool. Plus, you can transport it from one car to another really easily. Now, in terms of the passion for cars and motorsport, I get that. That's a pretty common theme. But I mean, you've gone down a very specific path here with aerodynamics and the composite side of making these aerodynamic components. I'd say that's a little less common. How did you sort of transition into aerodynamics?
So I guess the one aspect of cars I've always really liked since I was younger was time attack. It's always been one of my favorite forms of motorsport. So back, with Cyber Evo, Hyper Lemon, the June car, all these cool cars from Japan. One of the big things that made me really enjoy time attack was how extreme the cars looked compared to like a typical wheel to wheel, club race car that's often pretty bland. So the interest in seeing, the aerodynamic components on the cars and obviously in professional racing like Formula One and whatnot, just got an interest there. And then the more I read about it, the more interested I got. So, and again, I dropped out of school, so I don't have any formal education with it, but I bought every book that you would typically read if you're trying to study this. And then just a lot of, trench engineering, you could call it.
Yeah, okay. I think that's an important point you've made there, that you don't have formal qualifications. On face value, I'd have assumed probably a mechanical engineering degree. That's pretty common with a lot of our guests, but great to see that you've got to where you are in your career self-taught. Just sort of a lot of our listeners will sort of take solace in the fact that maybe if they don't have a formal qualification, it's not actually necessarily the end of the world. Coming back to those early days in time attack, and I think it's fair to say that at the sort of earliest part of time attack in North America as well as Australasia, the Japanese cars were head and shoulders ahead of what was being produced elsewhere. You mentioned the Cyber Evo, and at the time, I think that did a year at World Time Attack and did pretty well. These days, it probably wouldn't even make it in the club sprint category. It was a very basic car. And while you mentioned sort of Aero at the time, these cars were really, really basic. It's, to me, seemed more along the lines of when World Time Attack in Australia started. That was when we really saw people take note of how much could be gained with aerodynamics, and we've just sort of seen the growth of that. Do you sort of agree with my take on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So like in the early 2000s, late 90s, obviously the Japanese were the ones that were building the fastest and most developed cars. Like you said, the Cyber Evo, I think it went 2 years. It won the first one where it beat Sierra, which is another super fast, Evo that despite looking simple, like the two cars had like almost exact opposite philosophy. It's like that car was in a wind tunnel, did a tunnel testing.
I think that Sierra Evo was kind of one of the cars that when I was running my old shop, early days of that was when Sierra came out, and that was the holy grail. That was the pinnacle. It was unbelievable what they'd packed into that car.
Yeah, it was pretty crazy because they used to be a Formula Atlantic team, I believe. So they had all the resources of a professional team.
Yeah, correct.
And even when they ran at the track, you could see like they brought pros, all the right equipment, everything in terms of like mechanics, engineers. Eric Sue, he was at Cosworth USA for a while, and now he works for, I believe he's still at Acura.
HPD.
Yeah, exactly. Running their programs.
Still trying to get him on the podcast.
If I see him this weekend, I'll talk to him.
Please do.
Yeah, so I think you're absolutely right. That was kind of like the start of things going crazy. And then the Australians really ran with it as well, because in the first few years of World Time Attack, it was Japanese and then the Americans that were really, really close. There's a period right before Redline Time Attack unfortunately shut down in 2009, where like there was a transition to the US car starting to become some of the fastest. Like you had a FXMD's NSX, which is still a rocket ship. That car, I think, also started it as well, because in its final form, it had a Simon Macbeth who Aero package on it, which he was doing all of the Aero byte articles in race car engineering. So it had like a proper package, and then once he got to Australian, World Time Attack became, the home of Time Attack, and it was obviously based out of Australia. I think he saw the Australians really, really run with it. And there's a certain passion for motorsport there. Aussies and Kiwis seem to be pretty crazy when it comes to what they can accomplish and also their dedication.
I think we're resourceful. I think is probably what I'd say.
100%.
I think as well, it's one of those sort of areas where as soon as one team jumps on that aerodynamics bandwagon, develops something, goes to the track, and blows the doors off everyone else, the light bulb goes off for the other teams, and clearly, well, if we're not going to go down the same pathway, you're not going to be competitive. And I think for a long time, when our power levels, say a 2-litre turbocharged engine, were hovering maybe around 400 to 500 horsepower, which today is basic street car stuff, it was easy to fix lap time by adding more power. So at that point, maybe the requirements for downforce were not as immediately obvious. We could always just add more power. Once you start getting up to that sort of 1,000, 1,200 horsepower mark, it becomes sort of, the improvements become iteratively smaller for more power, and then you start realizing that the areas you're now getting held back on are cornering speed, apex speed, and braking performance from high speed as well. And that's where downforce really comes in, correct?
Absolutely. So, you always have a condition of either being traction limited or power limited, no matter the car. And yeah, when we were at like 400 or 500 wheel horsepower with even like a moderate aero package, a little dual element wing and flat splitter, it's typically, like you're saying, you'll get more out of 150 wheel horsepower than you will out of adding, 40 counts of downforce, most likely. And they can cost exactly the same. You can see when someone motors right past you. You can't really see downforce. So I think for a long time, because people couldn't see it and they thought just like a standard, they don't know the difference between two different wing profiles. This car is fast and it's got, this small little aero package on it, despite the fact that it may be a very efficient aero package. And that's what helps it rather than just being huge. It wasn't until, like you're saying, the Aussies got really, really fast in a straight line and they needed it. And you saw the transformation of lap time. It's like at that point, it becomes the biggest change in lap time.
Yeah. Obviously, most of our listeners are probably not going to be intimately familiar with Sydney Motorsport Park, where they hold World Time Attack every year. But I think a really big fundamental sort of the visibility of how good these aero packages are now was the RP968, which is won the open class. I've lost track. And turn one at the end of a long downhill straight, he was taking that flat at 270 kilometers an hour. No lifting, nothing, just turn in around the corner. And again, this is meaningless unless you've driven the track, but it really brought it home to me. We were over there about 2 months ago testing a very stock standard production-based Toyota 86 that we're racing at Bathurst in the 6-hour at Easter weekend. And we tested that at Sydney Motorsport Park. My first time, despite being there 8 or 10 times, first time actually driving around that track. And I think we were hitting almost 200k at the end of the front straight. So, sorry, kilometres an hour, not mile an hour. And that still required a light tap of the brakes to bleed a little speed into turn one. And at that point, the penny dropped to me. And I'm like, this is a whole nother world.
Yeah, the amount of downforce that car produces is pretty insane, and like obviously the designer, Sammy, knows what he's doing, came out of Formula One, and the car has a good blend of, kind of everything you need, a good suspension, good power, and a huge aero package, and it really shows, what it can do and the effect of the aero because it has the tools to take advantage of it. But yeah, turn one is, even watching it, on the live stream, still it's insanely impressive to see that car doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, I think we've completely derailed the conversation, but I got a little excited, so we'll pull this back a little bit. So you've established the fact that you're essentially self-taught, and you've bought every book on aerodynamics and data analysis. You're involved in racing, and you managed to sort of keep your costs down on that by becoming an instructor. I want to dive into that a little bit. How do you sort of rock up and get a job as an instructor? I'm guessing this balance of you can't just become an instructor until you've got a bit of a proven track record for actually also being able to drive the car.
Correct. I had a bit of an unusual kind of path to that. So when I started driving, I did it with essentially no money. And we have I don't know if it's okay to talk about going up to the canyons and basically street racing. We have a road called
Absolutely
Glendora Mountain Road, which is a 5-mile stretch that people have been running for decades. And essentially it becomes like a hill climb because, you learn every corner in the 5 miles. And so I picked up a book called Speed Secrets by Ross Bentley. I'm sure many of your listeners have heard of him, like read every single one. I would just go and practice something different every week. And then through that, kind of just got lucky. And I had a friend that was an instructor for the BMW CCA autocross. So I went to one event and I was quick enough to do that because I taught through reading a ton. I could explain, to students pretty easily. So after a couple of events, they asked me to just help them with instruction. We get a drive for free. Did that, had good results with the students. They were all happy. Then I did that for like a year. And one of those friends started working with a track organization that had just started. They needed instructors. So it's kind of like right place, right time. So I went to a couple of events. And then after that, again, like driving kind of transitions, whether you're on a mountain road and doing it on a cross, or on a racetrack, most of the fundamentals are the same. Obviously, you just adjust the speed, but started instructing there. And then again, same thing happened. Everyone I worked with was happy, and they just kept me around for a long time.
I guess as well with instructing, it's one of those things you don't need to be the best tennis player in the world to instruct the best tennis player in the world and coach them. The same could be said with driving. I would assume that probably most sort of novice through to maybe middle of the road drivers, when they are getting out on a racetrack, are probably making similar mistakes. So you're going to see the same kind of problems cropping up with all of these drivers, so you can kind of instruct them through it. I'd also guess here that your sort of technical skill set or technical knowledge from reading books like Speed Secrets, that's going to help you teaching people where they're going wrong. And what I'm getting at here is I think a lot of racing drivers, and I know a few of these people, are incredibly fast and they do it almost instinctively. But when you ask them what they're doing at a particular point of the racetrack, they're probably not going to be able to actually dig into the details and explain it because they're just going through the motions. They've done it a million times and they don't think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's when I did a season of Ferrari Challenge, and part of my job was to help with all of the video and data systems. And a guy that I'd actually coached for over a year, he was like one of my long-term clients for coaching. Ferrari is pretty specific about who it can be a coach of Ferrari Challenge, or even like IndyCar drivers are like, hey, how do I get in there? Kind of thing. So obviously I couldn't coach, but I was working with some that had tested in Formula One, obviously quite a good driver, and ended up pretty much doing most of the coaching for him because of that exact situation. Like he was a pretty good coach. It was just there's a bit more in terms of not only the information, but how the person you're giving it to receives it best. Trying to find those tools of, you say the same thing to three different people, they're gonna take it three different ways often. So finding the best way to provide the information, came from that.
I think we see exactly the same in what we teach here at HPA. I mean, my background, I'm self-taught. My background is EFI tuning, engine building and wiring. And when we try and find additional instructors to come and join us here at HPA, the problem is there's some excellent tuners, for example, around the world. But you don't just need the skill set of being able to tune an engine and get great results. You also have to be able to explain what and why you're doing a certain task at a certain time. And that's the disconnect that I think a lot of excellent tuners just don't have that skill set. And the same, of course, goes for driving instruction.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, let's sort of come back to your trajectory. You're doing this instruction. We want to get to your business, RS Future, which I think you're probably best known for. Can you sort of draw a line to connect the dots between what you've been talking about at this point and when you sort of got to start RS Future?
Of course. So in going to the track, for that long period of time, I'd naturally gained a lot of knowledge firsthand from building parts. It's kind of how I started RS Future in the first place. Was there was no aero package that I wanted, so started with making my own, and then also getting the background of understanding vehicle dynamics, kinematics, the driving aspect of it. Helped build a customer base since I've been at the track, 30 weekends a year for like 15 straight years. And then it also gave me the path to learning all these things. I was working at a shop called Autosport for about a decade. So learned a ton there as well, which is obviously a critical thing if I'm not formally educated. That's a big thing to miss out on. But I learned a tremendous amount there by a couple of guys that were really good.
Just for the sake of completeness, give us sort of a very quick sense of what you were tasked with during that decade.
So after about a year, I ran the shop.
Okay, straight to the top.
Yeah, exactly. So I got pretty lucky. And so towards the end of my tenure there, racing and time attack and competing, my buddy Christian and I would hop in a trailer and go drive to road Atlanta and come back, and that would take, 6, 7 days. So the time off, we got to a point where if I wanted to run a full season, I had to quit my job. So that kind of led to me starting RS Future. And then I'd always had a passion for it. And, being able to make a living, doing what you love is always awesome. And it also gave me the freedom to pursue other things, which is kind of how I got into, race engineering and doing data for other teams.
Yeah, okay. All right, first things first, there's probably a lot of people listening to this podcast who have either started their own performance automotive business or are maybe on the brink of trying to figure out how they do that and get out of their current 9 to 5. It can be pretty scary doing that. You've got essentially no backstop. What were the challenges that you faced starting RS Future and going away from a sort of a guaranteed paycheck every week?
Yeah, so obviously that is a pretty scary thing to do. But I got lucky in the sense of like my friend group, we kind of all are pretty similar minded. So it's like that, I guess that mentality just kind of happened with all of us. Like my closest friend, Christian, he runs Battlecraft. Another one of my closest friends runs a sim company called Position Advance. Another one, I don't know if you're familiar with Nerdy to Dogfight, but like he owns that.
Yep. Okay.
So in our circle of friends, there's quite I think just a mentality. So that helped.
This becomes normalized essentially.
Exactly. And then, I was terrified. I was ready to drive Ubers at night and do whatever I needed to make ends meet. But I got pretty lucky in the sense of because I'd been doing it for a long time, even if it was without RS Future. And I'd actually sold parts that I'd been making for about 2 years prior. So I kind of started dual duty.
That's always a really nice way, I think, of testing the water before you fully commit. Basically, treat it a little bit like a side hustle, make a component, even if it's just one product, test the water, see if there's a market for it, do your market research with a minimum viable product, and then you can actually make an informed decision. Does this actually have a chance of working or not?
Exactly. So I think that's always the safest way of doing it. And then also, like, I think what happens to a lot of people that start businesses is the scale at which they start with, the overhead, like keeping the overhead low. Like I've been willing to sleep at the shop if I had to make it. So I think that's another big thing I see from a lot of guys that start shops, especially because I'm sure you've seen it time and time again where the correlation between being really good at what you do and running a business often does not go hand in hand.
I've said this time and time again on the podcast, so regular listeners are probably sick of hearing it, but I will reiterate because you brought it up. I think that the usual entrepreneurial trap is you start a business because you're very good at something, and then once you actually get into that business, you find out that you can only spend maybe 30 to 50% of your day doing that particular thing, and the rest is answering phone calls, quoting work, chasing up suppliers, and all of the rest of the crap that goes along with running a business. So it can be challenging.
Yeah, absolutely.
How did you decide on the products that you were going to develop and market with RS Future?
Because of that love for aerodynamics, it was just kind of the natural thing I wanted to do. So it was, I started making them because I wanted a more competitive package than what I could get, off the shelf back in 2017, 2018. It was a very, very different time back then. And I mean, aerodynamics in general is like my favorite aspect of a car. I think it's so cool. And it was just a way for me to take what I really enjoy and then make a product that allows me to do that. So it's never really work.
Sure. I'm guessing here you're talking about sort of more generic products as opposed to vehicle-specific products. I mean, we've all seen the generic sort of rear wing that you can adapt to basically whatever platform. Is this what we're sort of talking about here?
Correct. So that's like I wanted something that I could make that I could put on pretty much anything, work on my car, and also work on most setups. So rather than the typical, and what was on the market prior was that standard off the shelf wing that really doesn't do much and is super inefficient.
More just an aesthetic addition as opposed to a true aerodynamic component.
Correct. And even some of the effective wings out there, it's like, what's the purpose of the wing, Because if you're running the RP968 wing on a Miata, it is not going to be very beneficial. So I needed something that was kind of in the middle. I was building a car for street class, so you couldn't run a dual element wing. And then at that time, we were all using kind of aluminite or wood for splitters. And a lot of the carbon splitters that were out were, again, more aesthetic. And it was like, you can't really find anyone to make them. I mean, even now, getting good composite work done is really tough. So started with just making my own stuff. And as people started to enjoy it and ask, I was like, okay, I could turn this into a business. And so it started almost out of necessity at first.
When you started making these components for your own car, I mean, obviously the stopwatch at the end of the day tells you what you need to know, but how are you sort of validating the performance improvement from these parts you're making?
So in the beginning, it was, obviously pretty crude in the first few iterations. So we needed to know if it was going to work or not. And we would just like, we'd A/B test it, pull the arrow off, put it back on. Then we would, back then we didn't have the funds for damper pots, but you could put like a zip tie around a damper and it'll show you kind of like roughly if you just drive it in a straight line. And then there are like some methods you could use, like even once you get to bigger budget, you can use damper pots. It's a pretty good one that's attainable. And then just like wool tough testing, flow biz, things like that. And at the end, I've been driving for so long that I'm pretty sensitive to, the aero balance and mechanical balance of a car. So it gave me kind of a big help when I was developing the stuff. So, and I could drive them in different cars, see how obviously a mid-engine NSX is quite different to, like a GTR or an M3. So having the ability to, like actually test it. And even to today, I do provide almost my clients with a ton of support. So often I'll go out to the track with them. And it's become much, much less as of late because of the pro racing schedule. But I was able to go out there, help them kind of develop it along with the customer.
Okay. I just want to come back to a couple of things you talked about there, because I think a lot of people, when we start talking about aerodynamics, their eyes glaze over because they think straight away they need a budget for CFD or wind tunnel testing. And what you've just talked about there is not that. You're talking about wool tufts, which I think probably most people could get a pretty good sense of what those are. And obviously they're essentially free. We've actually just done some wool tuft testing at the track with the rear wing on one of our cars for an upcoming aerodynamics course. Can you talk through where you would use wool tufts, what you're actually looking for, or essentially what information you can take from looking at video of what those tufts are actually doing?
Yeah, so you're mainly looking for flow separation areas that are going to be creating huge drag. You're using more like flow viz on like a diffuser. You'll be using wool tufts on things like the exterior body of the car, the wing, and you record it. You can see like if you have a lot of separation, or you can see if the air is becoming is no longer attached, and you have an aerodynamic body or component sitting right behind it. It's obviously not going to be doing anything. So you're trying to figure out where to put it, or where to place some of these components, trying to make the car as slippery as possible. And then also, if you're making things like, if you're adding a vent to your hood, you can use the wool tufts to kind of get an idea of where to put them.
Sure. Yeah, I think one of the uses that we highlighted in this course was the likes of whether you're getting flow separation from the roof line onto the rear screen on a production road car, which is pretty common from what I understand. You look at the Evos, they came out with production vortex generators to help keep that flow attached.
Yeah, exactly.
But what's easy to overlook is if you do have that separation, it's not staying attached down the rear screen, and you put a big wing right behind the screen, you're not going to get clean airflow that's going to stay attached on that wing, are you? So the wing essentially is not going to be as effective as it would be in free air.
Exactly. That's 100% correct. So, and then sometimes the location of the wing can sometimes being as high and as far back isn't always as they are the best option, which we see common in time and technical rules allow. But you can also see where if you build like a mount for the wool tufts, you kind of like set it up on the back of the trunk and you video it, you can see the direction of the airflow from the windscreen. So especially on cars that aren't running super high wings, naturally we're trying to keep the airflow attached. So the air comes down as it's going down the rear windscreen. And so sometimes the air that hits the wing isn't at zero angle of attack, or it's coming. You basically, with the wing at 2 degrees positive, it could still be generating downforce. So you can get useful information like that. So I'm sure we'll touch on it a little bit more in a bit, but some of the components you're putting on the car that are hugely beneficial for downforce, which would be like a hood vent or ducting the front radiator, you can kind of get a good idea of whether they're working or not, and then where to put certain things like fender vents and whatnot. Because I've seen it before where on a factory GT4 car, they'd put some like vents to vent out the fender, and we flow vised them and they were doing like nothing, which was interesting to see. So you can find out quite a bit of information, with a combination of two very inexpensive things. And you can search how to make flow vis online.
Okay. We'll touch on flow vis in a second. There's one other thing while we're still talking on wool tufts, which we again used as part of this B-roll for our course. The profile of the wing that we've got on the back of our car is, I guess you'd call it somewhat three-dimensional, And what we actually found as well, which wouldn't have been immediately obvious to me, well, wasn't immediately obvious to me, is that we had good attached flow across about 3/4 of the wing, but towards the actual tips, where essentially, I guess, the angle of attack, because of that three-dimensional effect, became a bit sharper. We're actually starting to get flow separation there. So again, just an incredibly powerful and free tool that can tell you a lot about what's going on with your different components. We also used that a couple of years ago when we were having cooling issues, and we've got a hood vent, so the air from the radiator and the intercooler goes out through the bonnet or the hood, and we found that just adding a little gurney lip along the front edge of that to create a low pressure area behind it made a massive difference to the effectiveness of the cooling. And again, it was just using those wool tuffs we could actually see what was happening. So yeah, real powerful tool. Getting on to FlowViz, we hear this, anyone who sort of follows F1, you're seeing free practice, the cars go out with this sort of fluoro paint on some of the aerodynamic components. What is it? How do we use it, and what are we looking for with FlowViz?
Yeah, so it's essentially a fluid that you can do it with something. We've been at the track done with baby oil and like use the dirt on the track. So you can like there's a couple of ways of doing it. So essentially, it's a liquid that takes like about a minute to dry. And during that minute, as you're driving, it is drying as the air is passing the car, and it gives you a very clear and useful image of what all the air around the car is doing. So for areas that are difficult to tuft, or if you want a bigger picture that you don't need to watch a video and is somewhat, more precise, you can just take photos of it and review it later. Flowbiz is really nice. And that's why, in F1, it's a super basic tool, but they still use it all the time. The McLaren came out half painted in Flowbiz during testing. So yes, it's a visualization tool since we don't have a wind tunnel.
Yeah. The fact that you say it takes about a minute to dry, I'm assuming on that basis you're literally spraying this stuff on as the car's about to roll out pit lane because you've got to get straight into it.
Correct. So you'll normally have like a spray bottle or just paint it on really quickly, and it's as soon as you're done, the car like rockets out and you're at speed immediately.
Okay. And I'm guessing it's also pretty easy to remove. You're not sort of permanently painting a car bright yellow or red or pink or something.
Correct.
Yeah. All right. Let's talk a little bit more. We've kind of started diving down into it, but let's talk a little bit more about kind of what goes into the development of aerodynamic components. And I'm going to sort of focus more here. If you were working on something custom for a particular car, a customer comes to you, hey, I've got this time attack car or whatever it might be, got a budget, I want it to improve my aerodynamic components package, and how you go about that. So I guess for a start, and maybe we've already touched on a couple of them, but could you give us an idea of where the challenges are in producing a truly efficient and effective aerodynamics package for what is a race car based around a road car?
Absolutely. So it is a challenge, and it's one where often it's diminishing returns and going to that level from what I've found. So often we use best practice kind of design for a lot of like the splitter tunnels, the hood vents, the wing. They're all very benign for the most part.
Maybe it should be reasonably self-explanatory, but kind of define that term best practices and how that would differ from, money, no objects, throw all of the technology and tools available at the project.
Correct. So best practices is going to essentially you're taking what you're pretty sure is going to work. Like, and you're going to get solid performance out of it. So let's say you're getting 70 to 80% of the performance for a tenth of the budget kind of thing. So you'll take like existing known kind of shapes, and like again from a lot of research testing, we'll know what angles for a front splitter diffuser, a front wing, a rear diffuser is typically you can get away with it. Then also for sizing. So that would be how we would start for a car that's coming in without any crazy kind of development package. And then from there, it's figuring out how to mount it so it doesn't fall off or break the car if you go off, because that's obviously a big thing too. Our splitters are quite strong, so we're trying not to destroy frame rails. And then we're just taking kind of like a standard set of parts that we know works well, and we'll just adapt them it's more of like fixing them on the car. So like, how do we mount them? Where is sturdy? Especially on modern cars now, it's really hard to mount a splitter because there's just so many heat exchangers in the front and everything's there. So that's one of the challenges.
I think it's probably a lot of people who have never been involved with any of these parts before how solidly they have to be mounted in order to be effective and also safe is actually pretty mind-blowing. Particularly if you've got a wing that could be producing 200 to 300 kilograms of downforce, perhaps much more than that. Understandably, the mounts for that wing and where those wing mounts are actually going, putting them onto the boot lid or the trunk lid, that's not going to fly.
Exactly. So at this point, most of our wings that we've worked with clients on are chassis mounted, so we're not too worried about that. But as we transitioned into making more kits, it's become a concern. So like testing, we'll do as much testing as we can trackside to ensure that doesn't happen, because you're absolutely right. Like losing a wing at turn one of Sydney Motorsports Park would be a very bad day. And I guess from there, if you're doing like a slightly bigger package, it gets really tough because to do it correctly, it gets incredibly expensive, because molds, for example, if you're getting them done correctly, it's like CNC molds, or even if you're trying to do it a little bit more of a budget where you're 3D printing something, putting it on a car, trying to make a mold of that, you can, for like a full kit, along with CFD time, you could be into tens of thousands of dollars pretty easily. Some of the bigger packages you're seeing where it would really require that, it's warranted and the budget's there. But for most cars, like, there's a couple of cars locally that, and I'm sure you guys have them there too. There's always that car at the track. We're like, how is that thing so fast? It looks so simple. It's got like narrow, it's, small little aero package, really doesn't have any fancy body work. If anything, it's probably like an off the shelf lip, some wooden splitter, small wing, and the car's a rocket ship. Because often it's the entire car being a package. And so I also focus on that with my clients as well to help them develop the car to the package, and then also get the most out of what they currently have, with just experience and knowledge I've gained. And then to go up to that bigger package, often you're picking up a performance or the level of performance. But if you invest that into something else, you would get much more lap time out of it. And that's what I typically do with my clients is I'll push them like, if you can spend this much, or we can do a full package. That's our, best practice off the shelf stuff. And then spend the money on, other things to get the most out of the car.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's, as you kind of pointed out, the old 80-20 rule. You're going to get 80% of your results from 20% of the effort. And I think if you can recognize it and understand it, then that is a very effective use of resources and finances, because, the stuff at the pointy end is not cheap. I guess I'll also preface this with, that's probably not going to cut it if you want to win World Time Attack, but you're obviously also not targeting customers that want to win World Time Attack. So you've got a customer base that understand what the offerings you've got. On that basis, though, I'm guessing where you get to save a huge amount of money is that you don't have to scan the entire car into CAD. You don't have to design all of these components necessarily in CAD to suit the specific car and then run a whole bunch of CFD. Or, if the budget and where you live in the world helps, you're not in a wind tunnel either.
Yeah, exactly. So, and then that's another big part of it too, like the correlation that you find between CFD and on track is often quite off. So that's why I don't focus too much on it. It's more, unless it's a very specific project, because it'll help you almost determine which direction to go. So let's say if you want to run a front wing or a front splitter on the car, and it's going to be a huge endeavor to do both, the CFD can be very helpful for, okay, I'm going to do this product or this design instead of this design. And getting that kind of information is good. But then when you get on track, I mean, even like 3% correlation on some professional teams and CFD suppliers that do just that, and they're running it on like 40 supercomputers to try to get all the processing information they need. There's like I read a saying that was like garbage in, pretty pictures out for CFD, because you can never know if it's any good.
Well, that was where I was going to go to next. The handful of aerodynamicists that I've actually talked to who do use CFD have kind of pointed out that basically, unless you've been living this life for a long time and you know the tool inside and out, it's very easy for CFD to guide you in absolutely the wrong direction, and garbage in, garbage out. So you trust the garbage out, go down a design path that just is completely the wrong way, and end up wasting a huge amount of money and going backwards with performance.
Exactly. So that's why I don't do any of the CFD work at all, because I haven't lived in it. And then because of the guys I've worked with, I do understand that, friends that have worked for, like Multimatic, ProDrive, like, what Pratt Miller's been doing with the Corvette, and have a bit of a insight in the background and knowing what it takes. It's kind of difficult for me to justify it to anyone when I can't even. You can get pretty close with correlation if you have a bunch of tools that you're using to test before the car ever hits the track, but very, very, very few people have that.
Yeah. All right. Moving on, for me, it would seem that for a production road car turned race car, it's going to be relatively easy to add downforce at the rear, just bolt on, making this simpler than it really is. Bolt on a big enough wing, you're going to get downforce. Hey, it might not be the most aerodynamically efficient option in the world. Maybe it's going to come with a huge amount of drag, but you'll get that downforce. Doing the same at the front is a little bit more difficult. And I think it's fair to say that in most instances, production-based race cars are generally front grip limited. So that would seem to be the better place to be focusing our attention. How do we go about generating good levels of usable downforce at the front end of one of these production road cars?
Yeah, so let's say for like your typical production car turned, race car that your average listener is going to have, you'd obviously start with a front splitter that had some tunnels in it, and, working on the protrusion to get, anywhere like 5 to 6 inches. Sometimes is where you get diminishing returns after that. You want it very well ducted to the bottom of the bumper so that way the air doesn't just go over the splitter, because that will stall the splitter. I'll often see it at the track where someone will have a lip that has a big gap in the front. So there's like a splitter, this lip, a huge gap that goes right under the radiator to the back of the splitter, and that's going to stall it out. So or it could help reduce the effectiveness pretty substantially. So ensuring that your bumper and your splitter have a good seal, then using proper ducting and venting for the radiator is huge. Because if you can control all the air going in and out of the heat exchangers, then you don't have to worry about it going under the car and again having that same effect of diminishing the effectiveness of the splitter.
So we want to essentially control and limit the amount of airflow that we're getting under the car. So you've mentioned there the ducting of the radiators. So naturally in a production car, the air just exits into the engine bay, and then from there it's probably going to make its way underneath the car. So we want to eliminate that and try and duct it out through the hood or bonnet if possible.
Correct. And it has a couple of other benefits. Your thermal management under the hood is then improved. You're not just melting things because you're getting most of that hot air or getting some of that hot air out. And then additionally adding some hood vents on the back to help get some air. So like if you were to think about it near the corners in front of the windshield couple there is often very beneficial to help get whatever air is built up there. But then it also gets the heat out of the engine bay.
One thing we found with our 8.6 race car, which we've done exactly that, and I mentioned before with the little gurney lip that we added, and I mean, obviously it makes sense as soon as you think about it, but one of the unintended consequences of doing that is you now have almost eliminated all of the natural ambient airflow through the engine bay, and we have a turbocharger
Yeah.
and a wastegate and a manifold,
Yeah.
and all of that stuff tends to get pretty hot, so we actually ended up having to essentially duct some airflow towards those components, try and manage that using a NACA duct also fitted to the hood. So it's sort of, you kind of go around the circles a little bit, but I assume it's safe to say we've got much more control of the airflow than we did in the factory car.
Yeah, exactly, which is obviously quite good. And even on and it's a problem that you have from top to bottom. Even on the C8s, most components like the starter, the alternator, the injectors, like a lot of components have like purposeful ducting that goes straight to it for that exact reason, because it is really a challenge. If you're trying to build more downforce, you're running into a combination of sealing things up, especially if you're using like wheel liners and stuff like that. And then obviously not letting the air out doesn't help. So even on those cars, they're running into the same problem where you're trying to control the air. And so the minimum you can have that's delivered from outside of the car is ideal. So then exactly like you're saying, you just have a stagnant air that's sitting in the engine bay with no flow and melts everything. So it's an important consideration when someone's doing this on their own car. And then a couple of additional tools. So like an S-flap or a spat that goes in front of the tire helps reduce drag and also adds a few counts of downforce. And then splitter end plates are obviously a huge help as well. You see extreme versions on some cars at World Time Attack or at Pikes Peak where they are massive. They're essentially turning the front end into a shovel. The goal is to have a low pressure under the splitter and high pressure on top, so you're forcing it down. And anything you can do to slow down the air on top becomes less efficient versus like, let's say, a front wing like an LMP1 car or a GTP car they call it now. Or even on some production-based cars that are under mid-engine, you can get a front wing on there. So you run into a difficult balance of A, getting enough front downforce on a front engine car, and then B, getting downforce that is efficient and not turning the car into a brick.
Yeah. Okay, so a couple of points there on that. Obviously, every racing class is going to have rules around what you can and can't do with aerodynamic components. Let's say that they're fairly generous, but you're not racing time attack with one car at a time. You're actually in door-to-door racing. So how do you then sort of balance the effectiveness of a front splitter, which could, let's say for argument's sake, it could be a foot wider each side than the outside of the bodywork at the moment? So how do you sort of balance off that's going to give you more downforce and be more effective, but also it's probably going to last 1.5 laps before someone else drives over the top of it?
Yeah, so depending on the series and the class, you get to a position where it's almost far more critical to not have a damaged car than it is to get that maximum, downforce. So having a splitter that sticks out 6 inches, 8 inches, both sides, it's diminishing. So you really, with the splitter in free stream, without it being a wing profile, you're really starting to not get much out of it. That doesn't mean it doesn't help. It definitely can add something. On wheel-to-wheel cars, we focus more on narrowing everything up and then trying to deal with the underside. And again, keeping those efficiencies of, venting the fenders so that way the splitter tunnels can still get air out of them and still, not have a blockage. And that's something that is not going to cause any issues. So it's like, or issues in wheel-to-wheel damage. So typically it's focusing on the underside of the splitter. That's one where we might go with a slightly larger tunnel. And we actually did that. Like I built some Aero for a car that was GT4 car, Mercedes-AMG GT4, but they wanted the class allowed a bit more freedom. So same thing, like we added fender vents to help with the splitter. The car already had a splitter, but being an older GT4 car, the tunnel was quite small. So we literally cut the tunnel out, designed a new one, and grafted it in to help because we couldn't just add stuff to it. And then all the additional things like splitter head plates and the spats, we just designed them so that way they all lived within the footprint of the splitter and were easy to replace if they got knocked off because at that point they become sacrificial if your class is a rubbing is racing kind of a group of drivers.
Which we'd like to think it isn't, but unfortunately sometimes it just is.
Yeah.
You've mentioned that term tunnels for as far as the front splitter goes a few times. So I just want to clarify here. I'm guessing probably most people are picking up what you're putting down, but I also know almost enough to be dangerous when it comes to Aero. So I'd explain that as almost the same as what we see at a rear diffuser, which most people have seen, sort of that gradual increasing in volume as we move from the front to the back of the tunnel. And I'm guessing here that what this is designed to do is produce a low pressure area on the underside of that tunnel, hence downforce. That's the aim of the game.
Correct. So it works just very, very similar to a rear diffuser where you're expanding the air and you get a little bit of a low pressure bump, which sometimes is big, right at the front of that tunnel. And the goal is to get it in a place where it's not going to stall with all the pitch and movement and yaw that it has, which is critical on there. So you're almost better off having one that is very forgiving and doesn't have a lot of separation, but doesn't have peak performance. And then I'd mentioned earlier about getting the air out. So as the fender well fills with all this air, you need to get it out. So often you'll see on many race cars, the fender evacuation or the back of the fender will be rolled into the bodywork so that way it has a good path out. So yeah,
that was actually going to be my next question. I'm basically using this interview as a means of making some changes to our own car, but yeah, we've been working on some molds to actually do exactly that at the back of the fender.
Nice.
And just time has not unfortunately been on our side, so we will get there. Now you've used that term separation installed there, and the idea behind making something a bit more sort of forgiving as opposed to trying to get peak numbers of downforce at the risk of having the thing a little bit more sensitive to angle of attack, etc. What happens with the stall effect that you're talking about, and how would that transpire to the driver?
I mean, depending on how extreme it is, and a lot of these parts, like you're saying, we're almost always front limited. So you're typically not going to have an effect in the direction that most drivers would feel where it's like the car's going to kill them. It's typically the car just starts to understeer. You lose that front grip. Your total front grip starts to go away. And like you'll just notice some corners you turn the steering wheel, it's doing what it should be. Some corners it doesn't. And I would say it's pretty extreme. You're really not going to see that with most anything someone's putting on a car, unless they're getting something that was just from a supplier that doesn't go the direction that most of us do. Because there are a lot of great companies out there making Aero, and they're all like, just looking at them, it's kind of all the same thing. Where you run into big issues with some of these bigger time attack cars, like I'm sure the RP968, if the center of pressure goes into a place it shouldn't, it could send the car straight off track. So center of pressure, for those that might not know, it's like kind of like the center of gravity for a car, center of balance. So you often put your center of pressure in a place that's dictated by, your front rear weight distribution.
So that center of pressure kind of aero balance, and that's kind of dictated by the amount of downforce we're achieving at the front of the car versus the rear of the car.
Yeah, exactly. So if they start to stall out, or one thing that a lot of people have seen before is like porpoising. So let's say the splitter hits the ground, your center of pressure goes from having like it could be in a place where it should be, then all of a sudden the front's doing nothing, the rear's going crazy and producing a ton of downforce. So it shoots back and forth. And what you're seeing with porpoising is, as the center of pressure is just oscillating tremendously as the splitter or front wings being cut off, car lifts, it gains all that downforce right back and then gets slammed back to the ground.
So this was essentially what we saw in the early couple of years of the ground effects era of Formula One, where a lot of teams had massive trouble getting on top of this porpoising at high speed.
Absolutely. And I'd be curious to talk to some of the teams at World Time Attack, because some of the higher level cars, it looks like they have it pretty bad. It's just you can't tell over a stream, and seeing how they're managing it, or if the balance of it's like the thing porpoising down the front straight still gets the best total performance package. I mean, they make enough downforce to have that issue. Most builders aren't going to run into this as a problem.
No. Yeah. I wanted to take a moment out of our interview with Amir and talk about a course that's going to be absolutely relevant if you're enjoying what you've listened to so far, and that is our Aerodynamics Fundamentals course. Usually valued at $199 US, you can use the coupon code AMIR50, that is AMIR50, and you'll also find that in the show notes. That'll get you $50 off the purchase of this course, bringing it down to just $149 US. To produce this course, we've partnered with ex-Mercedes AMG F1 aerodynamicist Kyle Forster from JKF Consulting. Traditionally, aerodynamics has been seen as a very complex area of automotive performance, and we've tried to break this down and make it as simple and as easy to understand as possible. We start by looking at the aerodynamics and vehicle physics, so we actually understand what's going on. This includes looking at the aerodynamic forces and effects and how this affects the tyre and the grip that the tyre can produce. We also talk about downforce and drag effects on lap times, as well as aero balance and the importance of car mass. We then move into considering what is a fluid. We talk about Bernoulli's equation, and we talk about viscosity, Reynolds numbers, and speed effects, as well as the boundary layer and Coanda effect, and what causes downforce and drag. We then move into some of the real-world aero effects, such as adverse pressure gradients and flow separation, flow energy and loss, and ground effect. Then we start looking at some of the aero development for club level cars, and this again, just like we've been talking about with Amir, is based on best practice here rather than going into a full one-off design for your particular vehicle. We look at the progression of touring car aerodynamics, rules and regulations and how to interpret them, and some of the examples of the rules and how to interpret them in some common series that we're involved with. We then look at some of the devices that you can add to a club level car, such as front splitters and canards, front venting. We look at rear wing theory and selection, as well as the top deck of the vehicle and the effect of this on the wing. We then look at underbody, rear diffuser, and suspension. We then move into the cooling system, looking at heat exchangers and how these function, as well as ducting and some good rules of thumb for effective duct design. We then look at development and testing. So how can you actually test your devices and make sure they're working? We talk about CFD, but at this level, this is really not applicable, but there are also some important pitfalls with CFD as well. These are covered. We then look at track testing using wall tufts, coast downs. We also talk about potentiometers and the pitfalls of using something simple like a cable tie around your damper. We also look at rear wing tuning and driver feel. Now, this is going to be perfect for anyone who wants to learn more about aerodynamics and perhaps start producing a kit of components that's going to be effective on their own vehicle. Remember, this course is normally $199, and by using that coupon code AMIR50, it brings it down to just $149. You are still completely protected by our 60-day, no questions asked money back guarantee. So if you purchase and decide it's not quite right for you, no problem, let us know. We'll give you a full refund of the purchase price. And you can also still break that payment down into as many as 8 individual weekly payments at the checkout. All right, let's get back to our interview now. That sort of brings me to the next natural point, in that the underfloor in particular, if you've got a fairly well developed underfloor, splitter, flat floor and diffuser at the rear of the car, the performance of that is going to be quite sensitive to ride height. And as I understand it, there's sort of a, within reason, the lower you run the car, the better it performs, to a point when it then stalls and you lose all of that downforce, and that's the porpoising we're talking about. So how do you sort of control that sort of ride height to get the floor to be as effective as it can be, get the car as low as you can get it, but stay away from actually driving the car into the ground at 200 mile an hour?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great point to bring up and pretty difficult to deal with and get right.
I suppose it's probably also worth pointing out, just as you've already mentioned, that this is not really going to be a problem at sort of the club level or even sort of the lower levels of time attack. This is a very highly developed aero package that's going to have these sorts of issues.
Yeah, so like if you're running in the middle of like any time attack organization, like let's say here would be limited class, for you guys I think it's open, where you start to get into these downforce levels, even like a GT3 car, it's the packer gap is critical. So that's how we handle it on those cars. And so it's each channel, like even in our data system, we can see like the packer gap, ride heights, tire squish, damper. Although on the Corvette, we run a anti-roll bar rocker instead of damper pots to get ride heights, but it's something that we monitor very, very closely. And like we want to keep it just off of the bumpers or the bump stops. Essentially, you can stack bump stops and get different rates. There's a lot of tools you can use to get the most out of bump stops, because I know the way that they're frequently looked at is if the car hits the bump stop, your spring rate goes to infinity. The car just goes either straight off track or spins. But that's not the case.
You've actually got sort of a progressive rate within that bump stop. I mean, obviously at some point when everything becomes solid, yes, your spring rate's to infinity and you've got no grip, but you actually can use that bump stop as a tuning tool.
Exactly. And it's an important tuning tool, one that you can use. Like it's like we were talking about aero balance and things like that. So let's say you want to numb the car out in the rear a little bit. You can have the front hit the backer first and in high speed corners, so that way it has a little bit more stability. Your front spring rate effectively changes and becomes much stiffer, which can also help with various things such as like transitioning the car and whatnot. But it's very track to track dependent. The level of a car that should be running into this problem, they should have a data acquisition system. And damper pots and measuring your bump height is typically going to be how you do it. And you'll be using what they call packers, which just move the bump stops up and down. And you do that, in certain cars where we were having an issue last year, we even tried like 0 millipacker gap. So like literally when the car was static, it was sitting on the bump stop just to try and test it. So I had to try it out.
Horribly?
Yes, because the car couldn't move.
How about that?
Yeah, strange. But yeah, like you're saying, the balance between aero and tires, it's a tough one to get that mechanical grip and not just, overpower the tire with an ultra stiff spring, but then also keep the car off the ground.
Yeah, it's new problems to sort your way through, and the problem we're talking about here is, of course, at low speed there is no downforce. So if you have the car set up with spring rates and everything that you would normally do for a zero aero package, you've got good mechanical grip at low speed, but that particular package at 150, 200 mile an hour, when the downforce is now come on, you're going to be running the car into the track, which obviously is also not going to be desirable. So you've got two options to deal with this. You can run spring rates that will keep the car off the track at high speed, and then you lose your low-speed mechanical grip, or sacrifice or compromise that, or you go somewhere in between and then start using bump stops and packers to sort of deal with just the high-speed portion.
You put all of that together very well. Thank you. That's exactly kind of the point there. And obviously,
just trying to summarize what is obviously a pretty complicated set of circumstances that you're trying to deal with here.
I appreciate that. I tend to jump from one thing to the next quite quickly when I'm trying to put it all together, especially on a topic like that. And then do you usually want to get into third members or anything like that? Or is that a little bit too...
I think maybe, seeing as you've brought it up, let's very briefly talk about it. But I think the complexity of third members and then the very limited areas that we're going to see them used probably means they're not that relevant to 99.9% of our audience, but you raised it. Let's go.
Correct. I'll be quick with it. Yeah, so a third member essentially is an additional spring or damper, depending on the setup, where it allows the wheels to travel with ride height independently of roll. So you can run it where, as the wheels go down or up into the body together, you can have a spring that helps the body or the traditional ones and keeps the car stiff in a straight line. And then as soon as you turn into a corner, you get the compliance. I won't try to explain the mechanical aspect of it because it's far
Please
too
don't.
complex without photos.
Yeah, without some diagrams, that's not going to work. But for those who do want to learn more, go and Google third element or third member, and you can fill your boots with a whole bunch of information. But essentially manages to decouple the heave movement from the roll movement, as I think is a way of explaining it. Does that sound about right?
That is correct. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Let's move on. We kind of started talking about underfloor, and I don't think we've really completed it. How important is it to have a perfectly flat underfloor from that splitter that we've talked about to the diffuser that I've alluded to that we haven't really talked about at the back?
It's pretty critical. Even like body gaps. So let's say where you made them up, like putting a piece of tape over them is important. But like sometimes you've seen it where if the splitter sits down like an inch below the floor and it doesn't have a smooth transition to the floor, you're just going to have a ton of separation, and your floor and diffuser are going to be not working anywhere near as well as they should.
Okay, so it's all about getting that clean attached flow right the length of that underfloor, because I guess what you're then doing is feeding that flow into the diffuser, and the cleaner and more attached that flow is, or better attached that flow is, the better your diffuser is going to work.
Correct. You just don't want to start building a bunch of turbulence and separated flow right in front of the diffuser, which is often what can happen if you have a bunch of bolts hanging down or random things here and there. The bottom of most professional race cars is insanely flat. And even, if it wasn't against the rules, we'd tape up the floors. But panel gaps, since it's somewhat of a related topic for listeners that might want a bit of free or easy performance, that you see is how critical panel gaps are. So you see cars with like horrible fitment, the amount of drag that creates is massive. It's important enough that Porsche, when you're at Le Mans, lost because of their panel gaps and the straightaways there being so critical.
Wow. Okay, so if you can tape those up, there's time to be had.
Yeah.
Okay. One of the problems that comes with a flat underfloor, and I've kind of experienced this myself, and it came as absolutely no surprise, things get hot. Particularly if you've got a front engine car and you're exiting that exhaust at the rear of the car, which is obviously typical. The exhaust runs the length of the transmission tunnel. Normally, it's cooled by ambient airflow over all those components because it's open. Close that up with a flat floor and that all goes away. And we experienced that. We have got a flat floor for our 8.6 that we've tested a couple of times. I haven't got conclusive data on whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. And because it's a prototype, it weighs damn ton. So I don't really like running it when I can't prove it works. We ran it for one race. It worked really well until I came in for a compulsory pit stop. The car's paddle shifted, so you don't use the clutch except for getting out of the pits. And when I came into the pits, what I didn't realize is that the clutch fluid had boiled because of the heat.
Yeah.
Put my foot on the clutch, went straight to the floor. I'm in first gear, the thing stalls, and that wasn't great. So yeah, how can we deal with the heat generated by that exhaust and no more ambient airflow?
It's very difficult, and to be honest, running a flat floor is a huge challenge. So for anyone that's thinking about doing it, there's a lot of time and effort that you do need to put into it, and a lot of thought, kind of like you're explaining. Obviously the least ideal option is to open up a bunch of ducts and feed them from the floor, to these components. But getting the flow out on a front engine car, it's so layout specific. It's tough because let's say if you're running your floor pretty close to the ground and there's a gap between the chassis, I've been seeing guys put in like Uber fans and suck it and send it out of the back of the car or out of the sides. So opening up a path for the air to get in and out is huge. And then also your servicing of the vehicle transforms because the amount of heat in there, you have to pay so much attention to it, double check everything. It becomes almost like a pretty high level vehicle. The other option is if you have a front engine car, I like to use some of that Inconel heat shielding that's you started to see on like even factory cars, like Porsche has them, but that will transform your exhaust temperatures from what's typical EGTs on the exterior of the component, let's say 700-800 degrees or something like that, potentially way more,
Yeah, probably, yeah,
to like 200 degrees.
Yeah, we went down that path with the headers, exhaust housing, and the wastegate dump pipe and front pipe on that car, and engine bay temperatures were literally halved.
Yeah.
And there are some companies around now that are actually starting to offer that for what is not a ridiculous amount of money. Sadly, that wasn't the company that we used, and that hurt. But yeah, I digress. It's a very effective system. What I did want to ask about is the use of something like one or two necker ducts on the underfloor to get airflow into that exhaust. I guess this is a compromise. You're going to get cooling airflow, but it is going to sacrifice the ultimate usefulness or effectiveness of the underfloor.
Correct. So you can't put a duct in the floor as long as it has a place to go. It's just sometimes that's not enough, depending on what your thermal issues are. And you can even do it sometimes from the hood. Like we saw Porsche do it, I think on the GT3 RS or the GT2, where they have ducts on the hood that go out to the brakes. You could do something similar where it just goes into the engine bay and then feed the air out some other way. You can do that. Or sometimes what manufacturers will do is the front hood duct is very, very complex. And they'll have everything from like engine thermal management to driver cooling to ducting to critical components, all built into this one kind of radiator duct. And then getting it out becomes the hard part.
Yep, yep. What I had always intended to do with our particular vehicle, just to get some data on it, and I guess this is a case of do as I say, not as I do. I was simply going to put a temperature sensor in the transmission tunnel before the flat floor went on, just get some data points of what is typical temperatures that we're actually seeing when we're on track, when we're stationary in the pits, and then double check that, compare that to with a flat floor, and then that would kind of give me a sense of what we actually need to do. How much airflow do we actually need to kind of get us back sort of into that ballpark? And obviously, if everything worked and you weren't melting stuff without the flat floor, if we can match those temperatures, we should be pretty much golden.
So that's a great idea. And obviously data would be the best way of knowing, and you're pretty good at that. So I'm sure you'll figure it out.
I think we'll probably be all right there. All right, we kind of talked a little bit about cooling ducts already. We've talked about the cooling package and venting out through the hood. Are there any kind of like best practices on where to pick up for the likes of engine oil coolers, transmission coolers, and maybe brake cooling ducts? I'm guessing we want these at a high pressure area so we've got good airflow into them.
Correct. So obviously the front bumper, you'll often on most front engine cars, you see that's where most of your vents and ducts are, because you do want to have it in a location where it's actually going to get air into it. But just like NACA ducts on the hood, we were talking about for inlet side of it, and then outlet side of it, your wool tuff testing can actually help you with where to position your vent for that duct.
So exactly the same as you want high pressure at the inlet, we want to be venting into a low pressure area, so we're not fighting against that pressure and getting the air out.
Correct, because I've seen ducts before where, again, this is where wool tuff testing is handy, where you can actually see air going into the duct or the vent rather than coming out. So because of the location, the pressure difference isn't where you want it. So instead of, it does the exact opposite of what you think it's doing because we haven't verified it. So testing where to put it is pretty good there. And then there's some good photos online that show you what the typical pressure distribution would look like on a hood to help whoever is thinking about doing this kind of get a good sense of where to put them in the future.
Sure. Yeah, I think on that note as well, when we were doing our wool tuff testing, as the car stands at the moment, unfortunately, brake cooling isn't problematic for us, but we've got a single long slot for our two brake ducts each side of the vehicle, and that sits just above the splitter, basically at the base of the bumper. If I remember correctly, when we did wool tuff testing there, it looked like we were actually getting some really sort of pretty poor flow into that duct. So on that basis, I guess maybe we could actually get advantage from moving that to somewhere where we're getting clean, high pressure air.
Yeah, I mean, and the weird thing about aerodynamics, which makes it a challenge, and it's like you'll have things that you often happen that is the exact opposite of what you would expect to happen. So using some of these tools that you mentioned before, it's better than just slapping it on your car and hoping for the best. But a bunch of wool and some paint can get you pretty far in finding these things. So it's cool to hear that you've had personal experience in optimizing setups using these simple methods as well.
I don't know, necessarily some optimization, more just finding out that what we've done doesn't work, which, I guess then you
learn
know
something.
it's better than not knowing. I mean, I think Another somewhat valid, maybe best practice method is looking at similar designed cars that have been professionally built, GT3 cars, for example. Look at what the OE or the manufacturer of that car's done with their duct placement, what they've done with aerodynamic components. They've undoubtedly got more budget than we do. So, if we can not reinvent the wheel and actually sort of plagiarize their work, I think there's probably some benefits in doing that.
Absolutely. And it's surprising how few people seem to do that because a lot of these cars are so well designed. And if you were to see the underside, the floor of like the C8, for example, it really doesn't look that complex. And but it's so well designed that despite very stringent regulations, when you look at it, it doesn't look like much more than what you'd see at a typical high-end track day car. But the efficiency of it is just incredible. And where they're putting some of the parts, where they're starting like a diffuser, little things like that, you can kind of take and adapt it to your car.
Sure. So kind of everything you need and nothing you don't kind of approach.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, I want to just talk briefly about some of the composite sort of construction techniques. It's obviously one thing to design these components, then we actually have to physically make them. And there's a variety of techniques and materials available. So could you, first of all, go through the typical materials? Obviously, everyone knows of carbon fiber, no big secret, but what other materials go into this? Because as I would sort of see it from an abrasion resistance and impact resistance standpoint, we really need to also consider Kevlar, which is far superior to carbon in that respect. Yeah, give us your take on what the ideal materials are and what we should be considering.
Okay. Yeah. So you're going to want a high quality. Obviously, your carbon fiber fabric is where it all starts. And it starts, as a fabric, just like a t-shirt would feel or anything like that. And then you use a carbon fiber resin that's designed for it. So epoxy-based resin. Then you're going to have, it's tough because it's so simple, like arts and crafts, yet can be so complex. So if someone wanted to learn, you can literally go get a piece of carbon fiber from a supplier, lay it on a piece of glass, wet it out with epoxy, and you would have a flat sheet. Would that be ideal or optimizing carbon fiber's attributes? Absolutely not.
Well, this comes down to the ratio between the epoxy resin and the carbon fiber, which, I mean, again, at an entry level is something you wouldn't even consider. So why is that so critical? Is it strength? Is it weight? Or is it the combination of both of those?
It's a combination of both. Excess resins actually makes the part weaker, which is why like prepreg is what's used at the highest levels of aerospace, racing, all that. And prepreg meaning that it comes with the correct amount of resin already built into it, and you need some pretty advanced tooling in order to use it. And it often needs to be frozen. They're just finally coming out, I think, with some room temp prepreg. That's pretty interesting. But
traditionally, also pre-pregs kind of out of our league because at a Formula One level, it has to be cured in autoclave under temperature and pressure.
Correct.
Although they are coming out with some out of autoclave style pre-pregs as well, I believe.
That is correct. So that's why I kind of didn't mention it because I know it's starting to change. But for the most part, if you're going to be using prepreg, you do need an autoclave because the heat and the pressure is critical. The heat's what cures it. So with prepreg, the nice thing about it compared to other forms of laying up carbon is the heat also increases your glass point. So like if anyone's ever seen a piece of carbon in a fire, the car sets on fire, it literally melts the resin out and it goes back to being a fabric. So prepreg has that advantage as well. And then
I guess you'd also say if you're laying up a very complicated component, maybe such as a full monocoque, you've got a lot more working time with pre-preg as opposed to a wet layup. But I mean, you can get around this with some of the other techniques like resin infusion, which I think we're going to talk about very shortly.
correct. And the only issue is like something as critical as a monocoque, which it's been done before without an autoclave. Certainly like Formula C stuff, I believe, like people have tried some interesting things. But if you have a void in between the layers of carbon, which can happen if you're vacuum bagging or infusing, sometimes because the carbon isn't or the epoxy isn't built into the cloth, you have to get it into the cloth. And for something that's super lightweight, super high load, not having that void is critical because otherwise, as you scan it and inspect it, you basically just throw the part out.
Yeah, that'd be a frustrating and expensive mistake.
Correct. And then since we started at the top, next would be resin infusion. So essentially you have your mold and then you have to vacuum bag the part. So you put this big vacuum or this big bag around the mold and you feed epoxy in through one side, it gets out the other side, and you basically it goes into just trash, and you've weighed it out. You know kind of how much you're going to need, so you have a good idea of how much resin you're going to need. So you run it through, and the benefit of that is it does it obviously under a vacuum, so there's pressure forcing that resin into the carbon, which again allows us to get closer to prepreg in terms of the ratio of carbon to epoxy, and it's still fairly affordable because it's basically a little vacuum pump, the same resin you were going to use for most layups, and the only thing that you're really adding is the bag to it and the pump. So it's the most common for anyone that's making, like I would say, mid to higher grade carbon components in the automotive industry, with prepreg being really reserved for nothing but pure racing at the highest level.
Yeah, I think for the purposes of our audience, we can probably rule pre-preg out for the moment. But as you say, resin infusion, I think it's a technique that with a little patience and not a huge outlay in terms of the equipment required, that's absolutely achievable. Other advantages with the vacuum bagging, which comes with resin infusion and just conventional vacuum bagging, is it's going to do a much better job of making sure that the carbon's actually pulled into all of the molds. So you're not going to have necessarily so many voids as you would with potentially a wet layup, correct?
That is correct. And so obviously you get a better looking part. It is lighter and it's more reliable. So it's an excellent way of doing it, which is why it's become pretty much the standard. And you can get vacuum even without infusion. So that would be like a wet layup, like you mentioned. So that'd be like the next one, to talk about. So essentially you would have a mold and you still have a vacuum bag, but you're wetting out each layer of carbon as you lay it down. So if you're making, let's say to make it simple, a hood, and you need like 12, 14 layers of carbon or whatever it's going to be. So you run into an issue with set time because the epoxy, as soon as you combine your epoxy and your hardener,
The clock starts.
yeah, most for like a slow one, they do make different variations of how quickly it hardens.
That's also going to be affected by your ambient temperature as well. So if you're doing a wet layup in the middle of winter and there's snow on the ground outside versus the middle of summer and you're sweating in a t-shirt,
Yeah.
that's going to have an impact, isn't it?
That is correct. So the hotter it is, so naturally it produces a chemical reaction, then heat is what it uses, obviously to combine. And so the hotter it is, you run into that issue more so. Like you're saying, like it will do it. It's called kicking. So it'll start to kick. And often it can be within like 30 seconds to a minute. So if you have a complex piece and you're like laying it out every time you put a new layer of carbon down, it can A, take a ton of time, B, it leaves a lot of voids. And so you run into issues where if you lay it down and it gets stuck because this stuff is super sticky, trying to correct it just screws everything up. So it's really less than ideal. But if you're making a small part and you want to learn, you can do that. And then also vacuum bag that to get the voids out. It doesn't do as good of a job as infusing it, but it can help with that. Not many people would use that method. You're either going to infuse it or you're going to have like a wet layup. A wet layup is literally, or wet layup without a vacuum bag, which is literally you just wet the part out or wet the carbon out, put it in the mold and let it dry. And that's going to be the easiest if you're starting to learn, but you basically could have a fiberglass part at that point. It doesn't really matter.
Now, in terms of vacuum bagging a wet layup versus the resin infusion, there is still an advantage to just vacuum bagging in terms of the product you put over it, the peel ply. It does kind of gets you somewhere towards reducing the excess resin compared to a full wet layup and just letting it dry in the mold, correct?
Exactly, precisely. So,
but not as far as resin infusion, which is a lot more precise.
Correct. And I'm glad you mentioned it, but peel ply, essentially, it is the protective layer between the part and the bag often. And so when you pull it off, it absorbs a ton of the resin. So it's a good way of making the part lighter and stronger.
Yeah. Okay, in terms of the use of carbon versus Kevlar, I kind of mentioned those two. What's the sort of use case for Kevlar on a race car? Whereas we don't kind of see it visibly too much.
Yeah, exactly. You really don't see too much Kevlar. So Kevlar has excellent abrasion resistance, much better than carbon.
Wheel liners, I guess, and underbody protection for rally cars is a real key area. Obviously, they're getting smashed with stones all the time, so that makes a lot of sense.
So often, like the rocker panels, there'll be layers inside, so that way it doesn't just explode and come apart. You'll see it in parts of the floor. All wheel liners are typically made out of Kevlar, for exactly what you just mentioned. Not like if it explodes and goes everywhere and takes a tire out, you're in bad shape. And carbon, has the ability to explode if you hit it. Kevlar tends to stay together. It's much stronger from that sense. It's a little bit heavier, terrible to work with.
No, it's horrible to cut.
Yeah, exactly. But it's pretty rare to see Kevlar in most commercial based products for, let's say, like typical end users. Yeah, but on a race car, it's weird. And again, this is the level of sophistication for a lot of these cars. Sometimes it'll be in the most random spot and you have no idea why, but they'll put it somewhere because they found that it was an issue in testing. So you'll see it in random places, but almost everything is carbon fiber.
Okay. All right. We could probably go a lot deeper into composites, but I am aware of the time and I wanted to move on, and I wanted to talk a little bit about sort of, I guess, a change in your direction at the moment where you're now involved in race engineering GT3 cars. And obviously you've mentioned the C8 Corvette GT3 a number of times so far through this interview. So let's start with where that direction change has come from with what you're doing.
Yeah, so or I may have mentioned before, like buying that simple aim system to having data systems in my cars and just doing a ton of research and learning how to use them in a club perspective. I ended up developing quite a good knowledge base for it, and then also the ability to work with things like V boxes, various softwares. Like we use Windarib for Bosch, you would use Wintex for Magneti Morelli. So getting a hold of these softwares just to learn it is sometimes a challenge. And then having a car where they have these components to learn them is a bit of a challenge. Got my foot in the door helping through doing some video stuff in Ferrari Challenge. Then that was my foot in the door to continue doing it. Worked for a season there, did all the video work for the car or all the video systems. On those cars, it's primarily just reliability, like if something breaks. So I helped the other engineer go through and diagnose the cars. But at that point, I was what they call a DAG, or a data guy. So like you'll have like data guys, and then you'll have engineers. And so I sit kind of somewhere right in the middle. So because I'm familiar with electronics, and then additionally have a very good understanding of vehicle dynamics. So that transitioned me into doing GT4 racing with a couple of Aston Martins. So we raced two of those in SRO, and it just kept kind of evolving. And the program evolved into running GT3 cars, and we ran a Mercedes last year. And this year we got two new Corvettes, which are like incredible cars. I can't say I'm a huge Corvette fan of the production cars. I think they're incredible cars. What they've done with them over the years has been very impressive, but the race cars themselves are truly impressive.
Okay. I think I'd probably follow you on that. I'm not the biggest fan of the Corvette either. I don't hate them. It's just if I had that sort of budget, it's probably not the first car I'd go and choose. Let's take a high-level view, though, for people who maybe aren't up to speed with GT3. What is the GT3 class? Kind of give us a sense of the concept of GT3 racing.
Okay, so most GT racing nowadays on a professional level is all what you call homologation racing, which essentially means that the cars are fixed, you cannot change them, and they're balanced performance-wise through what's called balance of performance. And there's like GT2, GT3, GT4, and GT3 is the highest level of GT racing, where essentially the cars are almost prototypes in terms of the amount that's changed on them. The Corvette's kind of unique in the sense of the engine, I believe, is like 95% original. So other than things like components to fix it to the car or dry sumps, things like that, the engine's pretty much the same. However, the rest of the car there's probably not a single part that's shared other than the badge.
Wow.
So yeah, like it's very, very minimal. Like every upright is completely custom. The sway bars are driven by a rocker in the front. The chassis itself, the tub, has additional strengthening that's done to it. So the GT3 is essentially prototypes that look like race car or that look like production cars. And there's a lot of the production kind of car in there. You're not like you have to run a pretty traditional suspension. And this is all homologated by the FIA. And there are certain weird things because they want it to look like a car.
So it has to look like something you could actually buy in the showroom.
Exactly. So after the death of GTE and GTLM, which is when you would watch sports cars at Le Mans at the highest level of IMSA, that became the standard for sports car racing, where GT3 racing is probably one of the biggest forms of professional motorsport in the world. Like SRO has series in the US, Asia, Europe, and GT3 has now been homologated for the ACO and Le Mans in the World Endurance Championship. So as the cars have progressed, they went from when the class started, it would be like, okay, we're going to take a production car and just make it as good as we can. Now, if you look at the Ferrari 296, the C8, the BMW, they are full on like impressive, essentially prototype machines that you have to go through nonstop. And the level of adjustability and what they can do, the performance level is quite high despite being fairly simple. Like there's no tunnels in terms of like a full diffuser that starts halfway through the car. They have rules where, like at the rear axle line, the diffuser has to start, pretty limited aerodynamics, but they still produce an insane amount of downforce for how well developed they are from top to bottom. They're all just balanced. So a Corvette could race a Mustang, which could race a Ferrari, Porsche, whatever.
This was going to be my next point. You've got these GT3 race cars being produced by I don't even know how many manufacturers, but as you just mentioned, Ferrari versus Mustang versus C8, maybe Audi R8, Lamborghini Huracan, whatever it might be. This does not on face value seem like a fair fight. You've got front engine cars, you've got mid engine cars, you've got rear engine cars, naturally aspirated, turbocharged. So you kind of glossed over this balance of performance and kind of swept that under the rug like it's just a thing that's really easy to do, but it's absolutely not. So could you just talk to us again without sort of spending the next hour on it, like what levers are available to pull with this balance of performance to try and equal that playing field between these different platforms?
So typically you would have your ride height is a huge one because the ride height and the aerodynamic control is very, very important on these cars. Your engine power can be modified slightly, either with the amount of boost you're allowed to run or with the size of the restrictor on a naturally aspirated engine. Weight is critical. So like one race you might show up and you're 15 kilos heavier and the performance isn't there. They take 15 kilos out of it. I can't really talk too much about the individual balance of performance of the cars, but just to give you a general overview, those are some of the things that they mess with.
Yeah, okay. It's nice though as well to have a balance of performance that essentially will get a Ferrari 296 and your Corvette C8 to the same ultimate lap time, but in different ways. And what I mean by that is maybe one of those two cars has some strengths in low speed corners and the other has strengths in high speed corners. I think that is what makes for interesting racing, because then the drivers are actually picking where their car has an advantage in like playing to that strength, as opposed to a spec formula where all the cars are exactly the same. And sometimes I think that makes close racing and passing much more difficult. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. So, and it's pretty interesting because I guess one of the challenges in balance of performance is to make a Mustang as fast around a racetrack as a 296 or a C8. You have to, like, the levers you're pulling and what you're changing, like you're saying, it's quite different. Like a Corvette or a Mustang will never go through a low speed corner like a mid engine C8 Corvette. They've done a great job of changing or getting them pretty balanced. Like, you see it in all the latest sports car racing. It's pretty close at the top level, but it makes it very difficult because certain cars that are, let's say, a little more slippery might not have the legs at the end of the straight to get the pass done. So you have to drive it hard into the corner. So it changes the driving style. It makes the strategy really unique. I think there's been a big growth for sports car racing as of late. And I think part of it is exactly what you're saying. Like there's a huge diverse field of cars that, anyone that are very relatable to people. Like an LMP2 car is a spaceship to anyone.
Yeah, it just doesn't matter.
Exactly. And then if you see a Mustang racing a Corvette, and you've always appreciated that, Ford GM rivalry, it's cool to see. And they've done a really good job of keeping them relatively close. But you always get it where one time or one race, one car is just faster than everyone else and vice versa.
Yeah. I guess nothing is always perfect. On the basis of what we've just talked about with the balance of performance and the different marques that compete in GT3, I guess you might have a dog in this particular fight, but in your opinion, which is the current best platform to be buying and why is it the C8?
So naturally, we just bought them, so I do believe that firmly. Like the team, it was definitely the direction I wanted to go in. So there are a few things that make a GT3 car, either good or bad. Because like we discussed, since you can balance and performance them up, and they're all pretty level. Why choose one over the other? Often it's like support. So Pratt Miller runs and builds the C8 Corvette for General Motors, and that is probably the biggest asset in my opinion. Like the amount of tools they have. They have like driving loop simulators. They have static simulators. They're very, very helpful, and at every race, to help guide you where to go. the tuning and setting up the cars, the amount of resources and tools you have from them is pretty amazing. So I'd say that's a huge one because you know that you have sensitivity in the car and you know exactly what you're doing. So let's say if the driver says, oh, the car has a bit of a mild push in the entry of the corner, you can see what stiffnesses you have and be like, okay, if we change the front sway bar 2 positions, we could get rid of that and then try it and then see everything from how it affects your stiffnesses front to rear, the roll couple, all those things. And even like aero wise, we have aero maps and everything for the cars that are pretty powerful.
I would assume that these cars are so complex that with the adjustability in them, you could, if you didn't know what you were doing and didn't have that manufacturer support, like you've mentioned here, you would very easily be able to get yourself so far outside of the ballpark you can't even find your way back in.
Correct. It does happen to teams. And so having the manufacturer support is with 2 new cars, it really fast tracked it because you're not taking that time to all race cars and GT3 cars have factory levels of have factory support. It's just what level and the level from Pratt and Miller is amazing. The car is also just a very, very well built car. It's easy to work on. Like we can have all the battery panels off in like 15 minutes to have it basically down to the tub so you can service it. It has incredible braking, handling. The engine's good. It sounds awesome. And it's also very tunable. So some cars are very numb.
So you want to be able to make a small change and actually straight away notice the impact of that change.
Correct.
In terms of the different cars, again, obviously balance of performance is one thing. Do you find, though, that while being able to put in similar lap times, one platform may do, let's say, a better job of looking after its tyres over a long run than another?
That's an excellent point. And yeah, the Corvette is actually really good at that. So you get the benefit of looking after your tires. Although sometimes I don't know how deep to dive with it, but even like let's say BOP, the car's terrible on its tires, they'll change that. So sometimes it's not as big of a detriment. They'll do something to kind of help it. Or the 296 and the C8 are obviously going to be in a league of their own in terms of the performance capability, like your starting platform. And then also the Ferrari is made by Orica, who is one of the most successful race car manufacturers, on the planet. Then Pratt Miller doing it for GM. It's like little things like that are why you decide which car to go to.
Yeah. Orica build LMP2 cars as well, I believe.
Correct. Yeah, Orica. So there's 4 manufacturers that race in LMP2, and they did such a good job that they're the only car that's raced pretty much anywhere anymore. So like they put the other cars, made them defunct essentially.
Yeah, okay. All right, so in terms of outside of a balance of performance race weekend, what are the levers that you have available to adjust, in other words, to try and dial the car into the track, the driver preferences, etc., basically improve it, make it faster? How much adjustability is there in the car?
There's a tremendous amount of adjustability. I mean, even things like we don't really do so, but you can even modify like your anti-dive, anti-spot, like the kinematics have adjustability in them. And then just like any other car, you have your dampers, so your shocks, some call them, spring rates, things like that. There's like 2 different like damper packages you can run. Then obviously aerodynamics is a huge one. The car is so sensitive that's realistically and so powerful aerodynamically that we do most of our changes through typical things like sway bar stiffnesses, spring stiffnesses, and then ride height and getting the car in a good window where aerodynamically it's solid. So those are like the primary tools we'll use. But then there's a ton of other things like our differential we have in the gearbox. We can adjust preload, so we can change kind of the engagement and release characteristics of the limited slip, but with the quick change in the pits. So you can make it really tight on entry or really loose, So those are the things we'll play with, and all the other things you normally would with cars, sway bars, things like that.
Yeah, okay. In terms of a race weekend and the data, which I'm assuming is still a big part of your job with this, so what are you, when the car comes back in from a practice stint, for example, what are you immediately looking for in the data? What's your sort of first critical things that you're looking over?
So you'll typically have like the cars they're very intelligent. So if there's a problem, you'll typically know beforehand. So you're either trying to solve it if there is one. And then additionally, you're looking at a combination of reliability, metrics. So is oil pressure good? Did coolant temperature get too hot? And playing with all that. And then you're looking for performance data. So you'll look to see, okay, the driver's asking for this, or we're a little we think we can get a little bit more out of corner entry if we lower the front. So you'll try to see, I think there's like 400 channels of data, especially after process data. So you can get overwhelmed in it pretty quickly. So every engineer they'll have something in particular that they'll look for, and they have all of these pre-layouts for the software built out where you'll kind of quickly go through. You're like, all right, let's look at what the driver is doing. So you'll have all of the driver inputs. And, sometimes it's like, is it the car or is it the driver? What are we fixing here? And naturally, the driver's going to think it's the car, and then everyone's going to think it's the driver. But so working together with them.
Well, that's a really good point. So how do you dive into that deep enough to find out, is it a chassis car setup problem, or is it the way the driver's driving the car?
So you can typically, like if it's often we're kind of right in, let's say if the car's super out of the window, it'd be obvious in the data. So you could just see like through like all of your damper data, sometimes like steering data, you can see, okay, like he's sawing at the wheel nonstop. We got something going on here. And with other cars, it's a little more common. With this one, I would say because of how good the tuning tools are, we're normally in a pretty good window. So it's just going back and forth with the driver to see, are there natural tendencies doing something that causes an issue that if they just adapt their driving a little bit, then this issue goes away? Or is there something actually wrong with the car?
Okay. I also understand, before we sort of started all of this, we obviously have a bit of a chat about what you're up to with the team, and you did mention you're doing a bit of wiring along with the telemetry and data. Can you talk to us a little bit about what's involved there?
Yeah, so prior to the first race, I did a little bit of the electronics. Now we have a DAG that handles all of it, but and then I deal on a race week with everything from like the managerial side of it. So I do act as an acting team manager when I'm here. Telemetry, we are getting fed every piece of data that we want from the car to the pit wall. So that's how we manage and verify that the car is in good shape. That's why when we get to the trailer, often, like I've already looked at all the data of the car running, so I know that it's in good shape for reliability wise.
So you can kind of ignore that reliability data and just focus on the performance data.
Correct. And then additionally, I'll work with our engineer, Luca, really smart kid from Pratt Miller, to figure out what direction we want to go with the car and work through, get a setup to the guys, deal with everything from like tires. So we'll go through a minimum of like 13, 14 sets of tires a week. So getting everything sorted out, getting them mounted, all that is interesting.
Lucky all of those tires are so cheap, right?
Jesus, you don't want to know what a tire budget for a GT team is. It is insane.
No.
Like $4,000 a set. So it is gnarly. So whereas like in Formula One, an engineer will often have like a very compartmentalized thing that they do. It's like this is all you look at. In GT3 racing, it's a lot more hats. It's still a pretty big team. It's 20 guys to run two cars, but you're doing a lot more than just looking at data.
You have to be a bit more of a jack of all trades in that class.
Yeah,
that makes sense. All right, I think, Amir, we'll start moving towards wrapping this thing up, and we've got the same three questions we ask all of our guests. The first of those is, what's next in the future for you? You're obviously on this sort of tangent at the moment, running these C8s. You've got RS Future there with the Aero components. How's this all tie in, and what's the future look like?
Yeah, so RS Future is switching more to like a kit-based business. Before, everything was a bit more bespoke. So been working on that in the background. Been going to push it, towards the end of the year. Going to continue with pro racing. It's a pretty big commitment. Like the calendar is quite intense, and you're always either in an airplane, a hotel room, as I am right now, or a pit wall. So
haven't got sick of living out of a suitcase yet?
Oh, I love airplanes. Like it is. No, you get sick of it basically 6 months in. So now it's like anytime I have to be in an airplane, an airport, or hotel, I'm not stoked. But we'll be doing a bunch of that. And the NSX, which some people might know of, which is like our time attack car. It was a street class competitor that we had some success with here in the States. Riley Stair has actually been on the podcast. Along with a good friend, Christian Wong. We put in a ton of work to modify it significantly to go to unlimited, which here is our highest class. So it's just about there, but things like we put in a sort of sequential gearbox, so we need to get axles made, changing some electronics on it, and to modify the bodywork pretty significantly since it's allows for a much bigger tire now. So
that'll be coming back. Bit of a fan favorite, that car. If we had a little bit more time, we were going to do a bit of a deep dive on that, but I think we'll save that for maybe another episode.
Sounds good to me.
All right, well, lots of exciting stuff on the horizon by the sounds of things, which isn't a bad thing. The next question for you is there any advice you'd give to a younger version of yourself to help reach where you are today in your career faster?
I probably would have convinced myself to quit and start my own business much earlier.
Okay. You think that's maybe sort of slowed your progress or held you back a little bit?
A bit, yes, I would say, because like a lot of the trajectory or a lot of the progression has been in the last 5 years since I started the business.
Sure.
Because it's just a matter of time. Like when you're there, I goes, typical 6 days a week, nonstop automotive stuff. So it was just to get a car built and work was a huge time commitment. So once I quit and started my own thing, I had the freedom to be more available for some of these other opportunities.
Yeah, I guess that's always a tough one though, because it's that leap into the unknown, which we talked about earlier, trusting that process is going to work. And also, it's a case of you don't know what you don't know. I'd liken that back to when I was running my tuning shop, and in the early years, I mean, I bootstrapped that whole business. I didn't have any money, and it was very much a case of earn the money, buy a tool, earn
Yeah.
some money, buy a tool. And of course, the big tool that I always wanted and needed was a dyno, and they're a big ticket item. Back then, my dyno, I think, was 120, 140,000 New Zealand dollars. So, that was a huge amount to me. It still is. And I used the dyno from a shop around the corner, which was an absolute pain because I couldn't use it at 10 o'clock at night if I needed to. He didn't really want to lease it to me. It didn't work for either of us. And finally, when I bit the bullet and got a loan and bought a dyno of my own, and I was wondering, how am I going to make these payments? And a month in, I'm like, I should have done this years ago.
Yeah.
But you can only do what you
Yeah.
can do. Yeah.
Yeah. And you don't know if it's going to be as successful at the time, but I would say that'd be the only thing I'd really change. Other than that, I just got lucky a bunch.
Yeah. I mean, better to be lucky than good, I think. All right. Last question for you, Amir. If people want to follow you and see what you're up to, how they best to do so, give us your social media.
Yeah, so my Instagram is probably the best way to find me. So it's rsfuture_Amir, AMIR. The business one is RS Future. And on YouTube, we have a channel. It's going to start getting updated more again soon, but it just went over kind of like our racing program and stuff like that for people to check out. And our website, rsfuture.com, for products if you want to see it.
Perfect. And as usual, we'll chuck all of those in the show notes to make it super easy for people to find. Look, Amir, it's been a real pleasure chatting. Great to kind of get some insight into a business that I've been aware of for a fair amount of time. So we really appreciate your time today.
No problem. Thanks for having me on. I've been a huge fan of the podcast, I think, since it started. So it's cool to be on.
I appreciate it. Thank you. If you enjoyed this episode of Tuned In with Amir, we'd love it if you could drop a review on your chosen podcasting platform. These reviews really help us to grow our audience, and that in turn helps us to continue to get more high quality guests. To say thanks, each week we'll be picking a random reviewer and sending them out an HPA t-shirt free of charge anywhere in the world. This is also a great place to ask any questions you might have too, and I'll do my best to answer them if your review gets picked. So this week, a big shout out to Big Ted73 from New Zealand, who has said, really love this podcast. I don't know of anything else like it. As someone who casually goes on track days, this podcast really answers a lot of the questions I've had and gives me deeper insight into all the aspects of car performance. Oh, great to hear your positive feedback there. And if you get in touch with your t-shirt size and shipping details, we'll get a fresh HPA t-shirt shipped straight out to you. All right, that concludes our interview. And before we sign off, I just wanted to mention, for anyone who's been perhaps hiding under a rock and hasn't heard of High Performance Academy before, we are an online training school and we specialize in teaching a range of performance automotive topics, everything from engine tuning and engine building through to wiring, car suspension and wheel alignment, data analysis, and race driver education. Now remember, you've got that coupon code. You can use podcast75 at the checkout to get $75 off the purchase of your first course. You'll find our full course list at hpacademy.com/courses. Important to mention that when you purchase a course from us, that course is yours for life as well. It never expires. You can rewatch the course as many times as you like, whenever you like. The purchase of a course will also give you 3 months of access to our gold membership. That gives you access to our private members only forum, which which is the perfect place to get answers to your specific questions. You'll also get access to our regular weekly members webinars, which is where we touch on a particular topic in the performance automotive realm. We dive into that topic for about an hour. If you can watch live, you can ask questions and get answers in real time. If the time zones don't work for you, that's fine too. You're going to get access as a gold member to our previous webinar archive. We've got close to 300 hours of existing content in that archive. It is an absolute goldmine. So remember that coupon code podcast75. Check out our course list at hpacademy.com/courses.